board. It's filled with styrofoam cup. So it's very light, very durable.
There will be occasions, there will be a lot more. There'll be a lot of different things. She's commented that there's a lot more than she knows.
Okay, and I'll be right back. Now is
This year,
I'm gonna cross off. You're gonna have our address. I'm gonna cross off the address.
during the convention.
Well, I'm all over, but I would agree.
4064.
For what? And it's the right questions. Yeah, the one
Mom writes down what she put on last night. Well, they had some support for us. We did really well. Oh yeah, we had.
Yeah, you can tell. Here you go. That's Sam.
Sam is a great man. You can tell by his hairdo. And I'm going to give Sam the mic for about 60 seconds to give you a little taste of what we'll be talking about at 8 o'clock tonight.
For years now, the schools have been teaching children to read English as if it were Chinese. Back in the 1930s, the professors of education threw out the alphabetic phonics method, which is the proper way to teach children to read an alphabetic writing system. And they put in this new whole word or sight word or look-say method, the so-called Dick and Jane method of teaching reading, which teaches children to read English as if it were Chinese. That is an ideographic writing system instead of an alphabetic one. In 1955, Dr. Rudolph Flesch, in his famous book, Why Johnny Can't Read, told the American public that when you impose an ideographic teaching technique on an alphabetic writing system, you get reading disability. Now, he said that in 1955. Now, you would think that by now, the educators would have decided one way or another how to teach reading. But here we are in 1991, and the method that's currently being used to teach reading in the United States, and it has swept the country from coast to coast, is something called whole language. And what is whole language? It's just the look-say method all over again, dressed up in new clothes of the 1990s instead of the 1950s. So instead of Dick and Jane, going through these inane activities and these primers, now they immerse the children in literacy, but they don't teach them how to read. They teach them about reading, but they don't teach them how to read. And so a lot of these children are having problems. As a matter of fact, I got a letter from a family whose child was put in a whole language program, and let me just read you what they told me. I will not give you their names or even the town, but it is a town known in this state for its whole language program. They said to me, in response to your request, I have written down my first grade daughter's reading experiences of this school year as I have observed them. I make no claim to having any special qualifications for the observations I've made or for the conclusions I've reached, other than the following. know my daughter very well, and I have attempted to be a careful witness to and supporter of her academic endeavors. Therefore, I can present the following facts with a clear conscience, and I believe these facts speak for themselves. On August 30th, 1990, the local newspaper ran a brief piece called The Kid Poll. In it, several children were asked, what would you do if there were no school? My daughter, one of the kids polled, answered, I'd stay home and read books and do adding myself with my flashcards. That's what I'd do. This response, though rosy, gives an indication of the anticipation my daughter had on the eve of her entry into first grade. My wife and I had taught her basic phonetic concepts, and my daughter understood to a degree how to go about sounding out words. With the beginning of school, progress seemed rapid. In less than a month, my daughter had latched onto the concepts of reading and would read aloud by herself with great enthusiasm. My wife and I reported this amazing progress to her teacher, and we rejoiced in this first great step. It indeed gave us high hopes for the future. Unfortunately, those hopes were disappointed. The zest and excitement for reading so evident in early October began to fade. In November, voluntary reading at home virtually ceased. This puzzling development prompted another visit to the teacher, but we were assured that my daughter was just taking a pause, a common phenomenon which would pass in due time. My wife and I have found my daughter's teacher to be a caring and conscientious person, and this is an assessment to which we still firmly hold. We became much less concerned and decided to wait. But the next weeks brought only a further decline in interest. While reading with my wife in early January, my daughter, frustrated and irritated, closed her book and walked away after struggling through just one sentence. She was just no longer able to read properly. To be sure, she could, quote, read in a strange sort of way. She would go right along, skipping words, adding some, making bad guesses at what she didn't know, all the while thinking she was reading. However, oblivious to the cumulative effect of all her errors, my daughter was perceiving only a vague sense of what the words were actually stating. My wife's and my efforts to get her to stop, look at each word, sound it out, and not proceed until she understood it had become exercise in contention and frustration. Several times I made specific efforts to get my daughter to discipline herself to slow down and accurately read only the words that were written. And this intensive work did have its results. She would seem to rediscover the abilities she had already proven herself to have in October. But after just a day or two more at school, she would be right back to where she had been before our intensive sessions. This resulted in my having a very unusual sense that there was a tug of war going on for my daughter's mind. In early February, I decided to do some research on the subject of the public schools. A friend lent me a video of a speech Dr. Blumenfeld had given to a group of homeschoolers in Albany, New York, several years ago. In it, he made the almost unbelievable assertion that the look-say method of teaching, or by inference, any system of teaching based on the look-say method, including whole language, the system used at my daughter's school, is inherently and fundamentally flawed, and that this flawed system actually produces in many children the symptoms of dyslexia. And he listed its symptoms. I asked my daughter to sit down and read with me the next day, and remarkably, I heard every one of the 7 or 8 symptoms Dr. Blumenfeld had mentioned on the tape manifested within one paragraph. It seemed apparent that our daughter, a decent, enthusiastic reader in October, was a budding disability case in February. Having now recognized the problem and recognizing also that our local elementary school seems totally dedicated to the whole language system, my wife and I decided to remove our daughter from the school rather than have her erroneously classified as a disability case and placed unnecessarily in a remedial program. Well, this is going on not only in New Hampshire, it's going on wherever I visit. I was in Alaska last month, in Fairbanks. You would think that in Fairbanks you could get away from it all. You know, it's far enough away. But right there in Fairbanks, they were using whole language, and parents there had protested. And there the superintendent of schools had come back with his own report saying how wonderful whole language was, and just telling these parents to get lost. And the teachers of whole language had been told by their professors, you must resist the parents. You must do what you're told by us, not your superintendents, not your school boards, not by anyone else. That whole language is some kind of sacred trust. And the kids have to be taught that way, whether the parents like it or not. This is what the teachers are being told by the professors of education who've been shoving this thing down the throats of the parents of America. You see, the professors of education have their own agenda. They have no intention of teaching American children to read. They are turning them into illiterates. Now, some kids may learn to read some way, but they don't become very good readers if they're taught only whole language. Perhaps you don't know the difference between alphabetic phonics and an ellipse method such as whole language. Well, ours is an alphabetic writing system. What does that mean? It means that we use an alphabet. Now, how do you teach an alphabetic writing system? Well, first of all, what is an alphabet? An alphabet is a set of graphic symbols that stand for the irreducible speech sounds of the language. That's what those letters are. They're not there just for decoration. They actually mean something. They stand for the irreducible speech sounds of the language. The alphabet was invented about 2,000 years BC. And prior to that, human beings used pictographs first. That is, they used little symbols that you could read very easily because the symbols looked like the things they represented, a tree, a man, etc. But then as civilization became more complex, the scribes had to begin drawing pictures of things that did not lend themselves to depiction. I mean, how do you draw pictures of ideas? How do you draw a picture of good and evil, or right and wrong? How do you draw a picture of sincere, or method, or determined? How do you draw a picture of determined? You can't. So what do? You draw a little picture and you say, this stands for determined. It doesn't look like determined, but it's determined. The scribes created thousands and thousands of such symbols, none of which look like the things they represented. Now, Chinese is such a writing system. They have 50,000 such symbols that you've got to learn to recognize if you want to become literate in China. You have to at least memorize 5,000 to be able to read a newspaper. Now, they're very difficult to memorize, very easy to forget. Well, about 2,000 years BC, somebody made a remarkable discovery. Somebody discovered that all of human language, everything we say, is composed of a small number of irreducible speech sounds. So that individual said, why don't I create a set of letters to stand for the speech sounds of the language, and we will have a very simple, easy means of transcribing the spoken word directly into written form, and an equally simple means of translating the written language back into its spoken form. And so the alphabet, the first alphabet, was invented. Now, how do you teach a child to read an alphabetic writing system? And incidentally, after the alphabet was invented, it swept away hieroglyphics and ideographs from the Western world, and we all went alphabetic. Because now you could do so much with so little. You didn't need thousands and thousands of symbols. All you needed was 26 letters of the alphabet. That's all you needed, at least for the English alphabet. In any case, how do you teach a child to read an alphabetic writing system? Well, for years, it was done in the simplest, most mechanical way. The first step, you teach the child to recognize the letters of the alphabet. We all know how to do that, the ABC, the alphabet songs, blocks, etc. The second step, in the second step, you teach the child the sounds that the letters stand for. And for hundreds of years, this was done in a very simple, mechanical way. They would teach the child, for example, the letter B stood for the consonant B, the letter M stood for the consonant M, and then they would join the consonant letters with the vowel letters, and they would drill the child in the consonant-vowel combinations, such as baby, bibo, bu, may, me, my, mo, mu. Now, when they were teaching the short vowels, they would put the vowel in front of the consonant. Ab, ed, im, am, 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 im, am. That was how they did it. Now, the purpose of that drill was to make sure that the child developed an automatic association between letters and sounds, so that when the child sees the letters, he hears the sounds. You see, that's how you become a phonetic reader. You see the letters, you hear the sounds. And then when you complete that, then you're given words and sentences and little stories to read, which you can sound out quite easily. Now, that was the method that was used in this country. That was the method that was used by George Washington's parents and Benjamin Franklin's parents and Abraham Lincoln's parents to teach children to read in this country. That's the way children were taught to read until about the early part of this century. And the big switch came in the 1930s when the professors decided to change all of that. They decided to teach children to read English as if it were an ideographic writing system, not a phonetic system, but an ideographic system, like the systems that were discarded by our ancestors, like Chinese, which is a very difficult system to learn. As a matter of fact, the Chinese writing system is so difficult that it has kept the Chinese behind the West, far behind us. And they're very intelligent people. We know that the Chinese are inherently, have superior intelligence, because when they come to the United States and go to school, they become valedictorians. They become scientists. They do very well. But their writing system is so difficult that it is actually stymied through the development of their own language. In any case, here we have our great alphabetic writing system, which has managed to produce the world's greatest literature and the highest literacy rate of any nation on earth. The United States had that. As a matter of fact, in 1930, the illiteracy rate among urban blacks was 9.2%, which meant that in 1930, the literacy rate of urban blacks was over 90%. Today, the illiteracy rate among urban blacks is between 40 and 50%. Well, what's happened? Have blacks lost the ability to learn to read? Obviously not. It's this teaching method. This teaching method. Now, how do they teach children to read English this way? Well, they generally do teach the first step. They do teach the children to recognize the letters of the alphabet. That can't be avoided, you see, because most kids come to school already knowing the alphabet. But then they skip step 2. You see, they don't want the child to develop an automatic association between letters and sounds. They want to prevent that development from taking place. And so they go directly to step 3, and they teach what is known as a sight vocabulary. Now, what is a sight vocabulary? A sight vocabulary is having children memorize words without their knowing that the letters stand for anything. As far as they're concerned, those letters are a bunch of arbitrary squiggles with no meaning whatsoever. They don't know why the letters are arranged in any particular way in a word. All they're told is that this is the word, you've got to memorize it. Now, how do they actually teach a sight vocabulary? Well, let's take a word, for example, like horse, H-O-R-S-E. The first thing the teacher will do is put a little frame around it. They call that the configuration clue. So she'll put a little frame around H-O-R-S-E, and she'll tell the kids, see the little horse in the frame? See the picture of the horse? Now, you and I know that H-O-R-S-E doesn't look like a horse. So how does a child see a horse in that frame? You know how? Any way he can. Maybe the H will remind him of a horse, maybe the O, maybe the R, maybe the S, maybe the E. So the child looks at the word backwards and forwards, top to bottom, he's looking for a clue that will remind him of a horse. We don't know what that clue will be. That's why these kids read in all directions. That's why their eyes are never focused, because they're looking all over the place for the clue. Well, of course, they know that it's not enough to simply put a frame around a word and tell the child to remember it. So what they also provide, besides the configuration clue, they provide what they call the picture clues. When they introduce the word horse, they have so many pictures of horses on the page that the child concludes, this word must say horse. But of course, you can't always have pictures of horses on whenever you use the word horse. You've got other things to illustrate. So they provide what they call context clues. For example, they'll put the word horse in a sentence such as, the man put the saddle on the, and And the child will think, well, it could be a camel, could be a donkey, could be the fence. Maybe he's putting it on the fence. He may guess horse. He may not guess horse. Now, to reduce the ridiculousness of the guessing, they also teach what they call phonetic clues. Now, here's where things get very confusing for many parents, because when they go to school and ask the teacher, do you teach phonics? They all say yes. There isn't a teacher of reading in the United States who will say that they don't teach phonics. They all say they teach phonics, but they do not teach step 2. What they are teaching are phonetic clues. They are teaching beginning consonant sounds. They're teaching the child, for example, that the word begins with H. It couldn't possibly be bologna or barbecue, but it could be house, hotel, hovel, hearse, or horse. Supposedly that's going to reduce the parameters of the guessing. He'll only guess words that begin with H. That's what you might think. But the leading teacher of reading in the United States, Dr. Kenneth Goodman, who is the chief guru of whole language, he told the reporter, first of all, he calls reading a psycholinguistic guessing game. See, that's what the top reading specialists in America call reading a guessing game. And he told a reporter from the New York Times that if the child sees the word horse and says pony, that's correct. That's good, because the child is seeing the picture. He's getting the meaning. Well, if that child can't tell the difference between a pony and a horse, he's in big trouble. Especially in later life, when he's got to read some pretty complex fine print. I mean, you wouldn't want that individual trained that way to draw up your will or your policy or your mortgage. We live in a society that demands accuracy, precision, particularly in our industry, in our technology, and yet here's a school system that advocates inaccuracy. Matter of fact, I have them actually saying so in so many words. I can quote it to you. I can quote it to you from a newspaper article. Here it is, the Washington Post, November 29th, 1986. An article on whole language. Reading method lets pupils guess. Whole language approach riles advocates of phonics. The most controversial aspect of whole language is the de-emphasis on accuracy. American Reading Council President Julia Palmer, an advocate of the approach, said it is acceptable if a young child reads the word house for home or substitutes the word pony for horse. It's not very serious because she understands the meaning, said Palmer. Accuracy is not the name of the game. You hear that? The president of the American Reading Council is telling you that accuracy is not the name of the game. When does it become the name of the game? You know when it becomes the name of the game? When that young person goes for a job and can't get it because he's not accurate. He's inaccurate. Then he's got to go through remedial courses and all kinds of things. Why do you think industry is spending $25 billion a year to train young adults in reading, writing, and arithmetic? Because that's the way they're taught in the schools. I could spend a couple of hours just reading to you the curriculum program itself to prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are actually teaching children to substitute words. Now that's what they were doing with this poor little girl. And she was coming home and reading in her inaccurate way, and her parents were rather surprised. They wanted her to read accurately. But the school was not teaching her that. The school was encouraging her to be inaccurate. That to them is a good read here. See? So what kind of educators are these? Then they don't teach children to spell. They teach what they call invented spelling. Have you heard of invented spelling? The kids are now told, you write any way you want. We're not going to tell you how to spell because we don't want to hurt your very fragile self-esteem. we know that your self-esteem is as fragile as an eggshell. And if we just so much as tell you how to do something correctly, we know that you're going to fall apart. And so you can write any way you want. Just express yourself. Now, of course, does that make much sense to you? You send your child to be taught by a professional. And that professional is telling the child, do it any way you want. Now, supposing you hired a professional golf instructor. You went out to the fairway, and you were going to tee up, and you took the club in your hand, and you said, is this the way I hold it? And he said, you hold it any way you want. Would you pay that guy $75 an hour? You could do that without an instruction, without an instructor. In other words, the teachers are not teaching. They're pretending to teach. See, that's the great pretense of American public schools now. They pretend to teach, the teachers pretend to teach, and the children pretend to learn. And unfortunately, most parents fall for it. Or they're indifferent. They really don't care. That's the tragedy. But the reason why the homeschool movement is growing is because parents do care. Now, so we know they don't teach reading, they don't teach spelling, they don't teach writing, they teach printing. They wait till the 3rd grade before they introduce cursive, and by then most kids' writing habits are set. They're going to print for the rest of their lives. They're not going to learn cursive. When I was going to school, we learned cursive in the 1st grade. Everybody learned cursive in the 1st grade. That's the advantage of being my age. You remember how things were done in those days before all this nonsense, this lunacy took over American education. We were taught to write cursive in the 1st grade. And if we wanted to learn to print, we learned that later on in the 3rd grade, or the 5th grade, or the 6th grade, whatever. But if you learn to print first, it is unlikely that you will become a good cursive writer. However, if you learn to write cursive first, you can become a good printer. So what's the most logical way to do things? Why not teach cursive first? Because what else are you going to do in the 1st grade? You need the time to do it, you see. You have the time in the 1st grade to teach a child to read. Now they're teaching the kids not only manuscript print and cursive, but Danielian, italic. They're teaching them 4 or 5 different ways of writing. Let me tell you something. A person develops one way of writing, period. A person will perfect one way of writing. They don't have time to develop 3 or 4 different ways of writing, or even 2 different ways of writing. So if you're going to teach a child to write, which way should you teach? What should you teach that child? You should teach that child the best form of writing we know, the one that's been developed by the best writers of the ages. That's cursive, the easiest, most relaxing form of writing. Do they teach arithmetic, incidentally? In American schools? Forget it, they don't even use the word anymore. You don't hear the word arithmetic. That went out long ago. When I was going to school, there was such a thing as arithmetic. Now everything is math. Everything is math. You've heard of the new math. I mean the old new math. Remember the old new math? What happened to that? Many of you had the old new math. Do you remember sets and set theory and empty sets? You know that whole set theory was invented by a German mathematician who died in an insane asylum? And that's what they gave American kids. They're going to teach them sets. But our arithmetic system is not a mystical, theological view of the world. It's simply a means of counting. Our arithmetic system is a counting system. It's an ingenious counting system that uses 10 symbols. And the way that you master this system, the way you become proficient at it, is to memorize the basic arithmetic facts. When you do that, you've got the computer up here. The computer is up there permanently when you're permitted to memorize the arithmetic facts. Well, now they're not going to do that anymore, because in the new math, they're telling the parents and the kids, no more drudgery, you don't have to memorize anything. You're going to use a calculator. We're going to give out these $5 calculators, and the kids will be able to do all their work on calculators, but how are they going to know when they're correct or when they've made an error? If it's not up here, they never will know. And they will have been deprived of one of the great jewels of human intellect, our arithmetic system. 10 symbols that do everything. 10 symbols that do everything. Isn't that incredible? Our place value system. And they're not going to teach that. So forget about the cognitive skills. Your children are not going to learn them. They're going to come out illiterate. Not only what they say, reading illiterate, but math illiterate or arithmetic illiterate. They won't know how to spell. And you're going to have to do the job. When are they going to learn? You see? So by putting your child in the schools, you stand a tremendous risk of that child coming out as an intellectual cripple. An intellectual cripple. And you know what they do with, you know what happens when a child is in a classroom where his mind is being destroyed? See, these methods are just simply not methods that do not teach. They also have a negative impact. They destroy the mind. The child begins to, the child, as a matter of fact, regresses, as this little girl did, becomes frustrated. Now, some of these kids, this method of teaching, I compare it to a non-physical, non-surgical form of a prefrontal lobotomy. They destroy them, you see, because language is the tool that we use to develop our minds, our vocabularies, our means of thinking. And if you can't teach children to read, if children become frustrated, they will never be able to develop their minds because they're not going to be able to read. Reading has become laborious. You know how easy it is to tell a sight reader? Anyone who does not enjoy reading is basically a sight reader. Anyone who finds reading onerous, a chore, is a sight reader, because a phonetic reader enjoys reading. It's so easy. It's so simple. It's so easy. It's so logical. And that's why phonetic readers will curl up in a corner and read a book and spend hours reading anything. They can read anything. But a sight reader, the sight of a printed page, makes them nauseous, makes them sick. I had a pupil that I was tutoring, a very successful restaurateur in Boston, man in his 40s, a millionaire. He told me that he would rather be beaten than have to read. That shows you what it can do, the psychic damage that it can do to a human being, the emotional damage. And so many of these kids who know that something is being done to them in their classrooms begin to act up. Now, how are the schools going to control those kids? They give them Ritalin. They now drug the kids, you see. That's the way to keep the monster in his seat. The little monster. They've created the little monster, and they use drugs to keep him in his seat. And of course, here in Massachusetts, as you know, you have to give your child Ritalin if you want him to attend school. That's what that trial in Concord is all about. Most parents refused to put their child on Ritalin, but the school insisted that he had to be on Ritalin or else he couldn't attend school. Of course, I would have told those parents to take that child out, to homeschool the child. Anything but a public school. And that's why they're drugging the kids. They've got to have a means of taking care of the behavioral problems that their teaching methods cause. So there's no telling what can happen to your children. I hear these stories all the time about, children being labeled, learning disabled, dyslexic, and all of that. So that's the academic risk. 1/3 of the children who entered public school in September, those beautiful little children who went into school smiling, thinking that they're going to learn to read, 1/3 of them will emerge from that process illiterate, functionally illiterate. Their lives will have been ruined. Their careers will have been destroyed. Their futures will have been wrecked because in the first grade they taught that child whole language or some other methodology, and the parents didn't know what was wrong, and so the child was considered learning disabled. Well, what's the spiritual risk? Well, you put your child in a public school and they're now doing everything in their power to destroy that child's religious beliefs. And how do they do it? Through such programs as values clarification, sensitivity training, situational ethics, multiculturalism, globalism, meditation, yoga, out-of-body experience. When I was in Idaho last week, tiny town of Haley in Sun Valley, I was given a Xerox of a program that they're using in the school there for having the kids lie on the floor, close their eyes, and have these out-of-body experiences. It's all very weird. Getting in touch with their feelings. Imagery. And they use words like this sacred ability to conjure up images in your mind. And they said, well, if a child can't conjure up an image, tell him that he's got an image. You know, just make it up. And there's some kids who just can't lie there and have all kinds of crazy images. Total waste of time, but they're working on that child's mind. It's a form of hypnosis. They're telling the child to empty his mind. And then the teacher fills it with whatever he or she wants to put in it. So they'll take a Christian child who's been told that abortion is wrong, or that lying or stealing is wrong. And in values clarification, they'll put that child in a situation where he's got to decide. They'll say, well, they'll put him in an extreme situation. Well, supposing that girl has been raped by a demonic criminal, and the child, the chances are that the child will be deformed. You've heard of that, you know, that it'll be a terrible trauma for that poor girl. Don't you think that she should be permitted to have an abortion? So this poor youngster who was taught at home that abortion is wrong will say, well, gee, maybe in that case, you see. So they just get the wedge in. They open up, you see. That's what they try to do. And then they work on the child more. Before you know it, the child believes in abortion on demand. Some kids do. It's the same thing with stealing. They'll pose a situation, they'll say, well, we know that you've been told that, you know, thou shalt not steal. But supposing your mother was dying of cancer, and the druggist down the block had the cure and refused to let you have it, would you steal it to save your mother's life? You see what kind of a situation they can create, and the youngster would see no alternatives. He might say, well, gee, well, maybe I could buy it somewhere else. You know, if he's got it, there must be some other druggist around that has it. No, he's not permitted, you see. They'll create a phony, artificial situation in order to begin working on the child. And what they do is they want to create what they call cognitive dissonance. You see, the psychologists have terms for all of the things they do. They call this cognitive dissonance. They create a conflict in the child's mind, and the child has got to give up one view or the other. And if he wants to be on the teacher's good side, if he wants to be on the side of his peers, for example, on the issue of premarital sex, which is, you know, all kids are for that in the public schools. You know, how many Christian kids can resist that sort of thing? Well, that's how they break down the children's morals. That's how they break them down. That's how they break down their beliefs by giving them all kinds of other ideas, telling them that, well, other religions are just as good, other beliefs are equally valid, other moral systems are as good, other lifestyles are legitimate, are valid, you see. And those children become so confused, that's why they wander around the shopping malls looking as if they don't know what they're doing or where they're going, you know. They're totally confused by what they've been told in school. So you put your child in a public school, that child may become an atheist, a nihilist, or one of these heavy metal types. Must realize that there are other influences besides the schools. They also teach death education. That's part of the affective domain. Teaching death and dying. You've heard of death and dying. They take the kids to cemeteries and funeral parlors, and the kids write their own obituaries and their epitaphs. Did you see that piece on 2020 last year in which the kids were taken to a mortuary, and there was a body on this table there, covered by a white sheet, and the kids were invited to touch the dead body. Some kids did, but you should have seen the looks on the faces of those who didn't. I mean, they were standing in the back, ready to pass out. Then they were taken into a room where they were to the crematorium, where the funeral director opened the door of the oven, and he took a little shovel and got some warm ashes from a recently or cremated human being, and he asked the kids to touch the ashes. And some of them did that, but most of them stood back as if they were ready to throw up. Now that's what is known as death education. They tell the children that they have to know all about death and dying. And you ask them why? Well, they say, well, that's part of life. And if it's part of life, we've got to teach it. Well, there are lots of things that are part of life that we don't teach. I mean, puking is part of life. You know, why don't we teach children how to puke? You know, the deeper significance of puking. They're just using excuses to get these children involved in these horrible subjects that may lead to some kind of very strange behavior. For example, since the introduction of death education in the schools in the 70s, we now have this rising tide of teenage suicide. And everybody's wondering, why are these kids killing themselves? Especially in America, they've got everything. You know, they've got McDonald's, Disney World, stereos, cars. Why are they killing themselves? And if you begin to study what they're learning in school, you find out that many of these kids become morbid. They become obsessed, fascinated with the whole issue of death. And also what they will do is they will put the children in a situation that makes them almost want to die. For example, they will give the child the Lifeboat survival game or the fallout shelter survival game. Have you heard of that? In which the children have to decide who is to live and who is to die. Who are you going to throw out of the lifeboat? You know, a lifeboat can only support so many people. Who are you going to throw out? Your mother or your sister? Well, you know, that comes as a shock to many children, the idea that those are the kinds of decisions that they're going to have to make in later life. And that's what they're told by their teachers, that this is decision making. Now, how do you make a decision on who to throw out of the lifeboat? Well, you do it on the basis of, well, who is more socially useful? Your sister or your grandmother? But the child says, gee, I love them both. I can't throw them out. As a matter of fact, what I will do, I will sacrifice myself to make sure that they can live. So he goes home, and he looks at the eyes of his grandmother and the eyes of his sister. He says, I love them so much, I'm going to prove to them that when I grow up, I will never throw them out of a lifeboat. And so he kills himself. And that's why thousands of ordinary, normal youngsters are killing themselves. Youngsters who are loved by their families. You will see that they have, you know, usually it'll say, gee, we have no idea why these kids are killing themselves. They have no idea whatever. Nobody knew why he committed suicide until the father went to the school to clean out the boy's locker. And what did he find in the locker? A journal. That was an English class project. A journal. And you know what was in the journal? All kinds of thoughts about suicide. This kid was writing about suicide for the last couple of months. And yet the teacher never alerted the parents, never alerted the counselor. You see, these journals are just between student and teacher. Parents are not supposed to know about these journals. Parents are not supposed to know what's going on between the teacher and the child and the student. As a matter of fact, the NEA in one of its resolutions said that they want the child-teacher relationship to be not only confidential, but to have legal confidentiality. Like a relationship between a lawyer and client, or a doctor and patient. They want that same power. Why? Because they want to keep things from parents. So that father went and he found out that his son had been writing all about suicide, and they weren't born. Parents would not want, and he kills himself. And why was he writing about suicide? Because in Death Education, they discuss suicide at great length. They discuss how to do it, when to do it, why, you know. I remember when I was up in Maine, there was a big story in the newspaper about how this high school was teaching death education, how wonderful it was, and these kids were getting so much out of it. I would imagine that there are some kids who get something out of it, but there are some kids also who can be easily destroyed by such learning. So you put your child in a public school, the risk is he won't learn to read, he won't learn to write, he won't learn arithmetic, and now you don't even know if you'll have a child. Between 5,000 and 6,000 children have committed suicide since the early 70s. That's 50,000 teenagers have committed suicide in America. Teenage suicide was unheard of when I was going to school. What, a teenager committing suicide? What for? What possible reason? So that's one of the risks. That's another risk to consider. The so-called affective domain. See, the educators now divide the school curriculum up into two parts, the cognitive domain and the affective domain. The cognitive domain is supposed to concern itself with reading, writing, and arithmetic, and knowledge. They're not interested in knowledge in the schools. They're interested in changing behavior. And so they even use the cognitive domain. They even use the teaching of reading, writing, and arithmetic as a means of changing that child's behavior. And that's how the educators describe what they're doing. A process of changing behavior. Now, I believe that purpose of education is not to change behavior, but to pass on to the future generation the knowledge, wisdom, and values of the previous generation. I mean, why else would you educate a child? You want him to have your knowledge, your wisdom, and your values. If you value your values, don't you want your children to have them? Why would you put them in a school where somebody else's values are going to be inculcated? Values that are in complete conflict with yours. And incidentally, through this affective domain, they create family conflict. Because they're telling the children that your parents' values are no good. They're not valid for the 21st century, or even now. You can create your own values. That's what they do in values clarification. The kids, can you imagine kids devising a value system? Just the term values is something dreamed up by the humanists to get us away from the word morality. Whatever happened to the word morality? They're always saying, well, we teach values. You see, when you say we teach values, they don't tell you whose values. Whose values? Is it the teacher's values, the parents' values, the values of the Christian church, the values of the Satanists? They all have values, you see. But when you talk of morality, you're talking about biblical morality. You're talking about the Ten Commandments. You're talking about absolutes, you see. That, of course, they don't teach in the schools. And, of course, they have kept God out of the school. And so the school is an atheist compound where God is kept out. And if you're teaching your child to be religious at home, and he goes to school, and you put him in a school where God is considered irrelevant, where the Bible is irrelevant, well, that child's going to say to himself, God can't be terribly important if my parents put me in a school where they keep drumming into my head that God is not important, that evolution is truth, that I'm a product of evolution, that my ancestors are monkeys. You see, in the school, what they want is the child to make his connections downward to the animal world. While in religion, you want him to make his connection upward to his Creator, to God. So you're going in two different directions. You put your child in a public school, he's going downward into the animal world, and he's going to act like an animal. You tell a child that he can't control himself, he can't control his emotions, his urges, his animal urges, as they're telling us now. They're saying, oh, well, you've got to give out condoms because these kids can't control themselves. They're going to do it anyway. Well, if you're going to give them condoms, they certainly are going to do it anyway. You know, because what kind of a message are you giving? Have you ever thought of anything as corrupt as giving condoms to children? In this day and age, where we have an epidemic of AIDS, a devastating disease that not only kills, but it kills in a very, very horrible, painful, slow way. And it's killing young people. Because young people are being taught that, oh, all you need is a condom. Condoms are not fail-safe. But that's what they're told in sex education. That's where you have the moral risk. The moral risk now is you put your child in a public school and they're taught sex now from kindergarten. Sex is now being taught in kindergarten. It's beginning. Now, in Massachusetts, we've had quite a battle going on over a textbook that is being used in Pembroke, the high school there. It's an absolutely filthy textbook. Leaves nothing to the imagination. Tells the kids how to do everything and anything. If you can think of it, it's in that book. Illustrated. That filthy book, now, of course that filthy book was written by a humanist. So it's won a prize. National Book Award or the Library Association Award. They're always giving awards to the worst books. And so the educators are saying, well, this book has won all these awards. But all you have to do is look at it, you know it's filthy. You don't have to be a genius, you don't need a PhD, all you need is a pair of eyes. And yet the school board and the educators have resisted, the parents have had meetings, it's been in the newspapers, it's been headlined, there have been editorials written about it. The educators will not be moved. So what chance do you have in saving the morality of your children in that kind of an atmosphere where they're being inundated daily from every direction, every possible direction, not only in what they read in reading, in so-called literature, but also what they're being given in social studies, what they're given in health education, and sex education, death education. Then also there's the risk of the drug risk. You know, drugs is still a very powerful attraction for a lot of kids. Now, of course, we have this business of say no to drugs. They're not ready to say no to premarital sex, you know that. But yeah, they've come to the conclusion that they must say no to drugs. When was the time they said yes? You see, they were always hedging. Before they finally, it took them 20 years to come up with that slogan, say no to drugs. Before that it was, well, marijuana is not really harmful. Well, there are recreational drugs, you know. Each one to his own. And the result is a society that's been devastated by a drug problem. And most kids learn about drugs from their peers, their friends. Friends that they meet in school. You want your child to have real socialization? Put him in a public school. He'll get more socialization than you ever dreamt of. And the interesting thing about kids who are hooked on drugs, they will do everything in their power to hook their friends. I remember when I was in a town in I think it was southern Oregon. I was given a letter by a high school student pleading with the parents to do something about the drug problem in the school. She said that every day in her school she was being pestered by her friends to buy a drug. This one or that one, and uppers, downers, you name them. Every day she was being pestered. Because these drug pushers want to get their friends hooked on drugs. Now, of course, they say they're turning away from drugs and they're going into alcohol. That's a big improvement, from drugs to alcohol. They don't just drink a six-pack of beer, they drink a case of beer. And so now you have many young alcoholics in America. And of course, when these things happen, parents throw up their hands and say, where did we go wrong? What did we do wrong? Well, if you put your child in front of a speeding car, the child's going to get hit. If you put your child in a school where they're throwing at him every single immoral, atheistic, occultish malpractice, that child is not going to come out unscathed. That child is going to bear some very, very severe scars from that experience. And of course, there are the physical dangers. Children are being assaulted every day in the public schools. We've had murders in the schools of Boston, but we've had teachers who were murdered. And incidentally, these murders are taking place not only in inner city schools, but also you go out into the middle of Montana. I remember a town that I visited, Lewistown, right in the smack in the middle of Montana. There, a youngster, 14-year-old boy, shot his teacher to death. But you see, children develop this hatred for school. They don't like it because they know their minds are being destroyed there, their morals are being destroyed there, their spirits are being destroyed, they're being dragged down to the animal kingdom. Don't you think these children know that something terrible is being done to them? Do you think that they're stupid? Remember, when they went to school, they considered themselves very intelligent. They had taught themselves to speak their own language all by themselves. One of the benefits of homeschooling. Benefits are so great that sometimes it's impossible to consider them all, but I'm going to go over them very quickly with you. The first great benefit is that when you homeschool, you're living in obedience to God. And if you're living in obedience to God, wow, that's the greatest. First of all, your family's on the right track. Your children have a wonderful model when they see their children, when they see their parents educating them according to God's prescription. Second benefit is that homeschooling creates a generation bridge, not a generation gap. The public schools are trying to create a gap between you and your children because they're changing them. They're trying to turn them into humanists or atheists, you see. 3, homeschooling produces mutual respect. Parents respect the intelligence of their children, and the children respect their parents as teachers. The fourth benefit is that homeschooled children learn well because they are self-motivated. And what you do at homeschool is you take advantage of that self-motivated learning process. Children are great self-teachers. The fifth benefit is that the parents learn more than the children. The sixth benefit is that the parents become more politically aware. The seventh benefit is that homeschooling is a safe haven for the child in a dangerous world. The eighth benefit of homeschooling is that you can make use of all this new technology. You know, the home can now become much more efficient place of education than the school because you can get the equipment you want. The ninth benefit is that homeschooling saves time. 10, homeschooling encourages home enterprises, family businesses. So the homeschool is on the leading edge of the basic trends of our economy. 12, homeschooling is convenient for the family. So there are the benefits. Compare the benefits with the risks of the public schools, and I would say that, my heavens, there's no contest. No contest whatever. So I will end here. My time is done. I hope I've been able to enlighten you somewhat. Tomorrow I will be giving a mini workshop on how to teach your children reading at home. I'll also touch on writing and arithmetic to some extent, but it'll be basically on how do you teach your child to read easily, quickly, proficiently, the phonetic way through alphaphonics. Thank you very much. Bye.